Well, welcome back. We're lecture 12 in our series on maritime Buddhism. During these lectures, we've been exploring the characteristics of Buddhism that were present along the rim of the great circle of Buddhism that extended along the shores of South and Southeast Asia. The form that Buddhism took was one that retained many features of early Buddhism: communal monasteries, monks and nuns living by rule, veneration of relics, construction of stupas to cover those relics, reliance on the oral recitation and memory of the spoken words attributed to Shakyamuni, and the development of both narrative and iconic art. By the 1st century BCE, written texts began to appear in a form of Sanskrit that referred to Mahayana as a superior teaching to that which had been previously preserved through oral recitation in Pali language. While the Mahayana texts maintained much of the same basic teachings, there were innovations. Multiple Buddhas, eternal bodhisattvas, who had not ever been mentioned in the early tradition, and the introduction of writing and copying of text rather than just recitation. The literary tradition of Mahayana spread across the entire maritime expanse of Buddhism, as well as along the caravan routes of Inner Asia. Now we turn our attention to another innovation that was to be of importance to maritime Buddhism. The term we will use for it is Tantra. Just as the Mahayana phase maintained much of the content of early Buddhism, so did Tantra have its roots within the previous development of Mahayana. The movement gave much of its focus to rituals of empowerment. The force of these rituals was in the hands of those who were trained in the methods of preparing and performing them. And one of the significant shifts in practice and thought brought about during the Tantra phase was the role of language in ritual. It's perhaps more accurate to say that there was a change in the way in which verbal sounds of speech functioned. Tantra can be said to use sounds in a way that was not just speech. The function of the sounds in combinations that at times resembled ordinary words was changed in ways that could be said to be revolutionary. Primarily, the sounds had their use in ritual context rather than syntax of sentences with cognitive meanings. In the ritual, certain sounds were considered to be expressions of power. Well, perhaps more accurately, the power of the sounds was activated when uttered in the ritual. Thus, this form of Buddhism created a host of sound structures known as mantras or dharanis. One could say that echoes of this can be found in ancient India, as well as the Prajnaparamita texts of Mahayana. As just mentioned, Mahayana brought written texts into the Buddhist sphere and made the words of these texts sacred. Copying, reciting, reading of the words of the Prajnaparamita brought immense merit. And even the physical copies of these texts could be powerful enough to ward off evil or other dangers. In this way, Mahayana was already prepared to accept that words in written or oral form could protect and benefit those who spoke them or shared them with others. This idea of the power of the written and spoken words also appears in other texts, including the Amitayus Sutra. There we find the promises that writing down the words of the text would ensure that one will never be reborn as an animal or a held being or in the realm of Yama. There will be no fear of death or dying because of the actions of Mara. Just as in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Amitayus states that even the place where the words are written will become a chaitya, a place with the bodily relics of the Buddha. The site is to be revered as sacred. Well, tantric use of sounds and rituals was a way of activating the power within those sounds. Just as writing down the words of the Prajnaparamita Sutra gave karmic impact to the performer of that act of transcribing. The sounds of the ritual formulations were seen as cosmic in nature. They were given from gods and Buddhas existing in multiverses and endless time. The attempt to understand linguistic meaning of mantras and dharanis has little to do with the functions of sounds in tantric rituals. In order to make those sounds active and useful, their power had to be activated through the strict patterns of ritual sequence and precision of pronunciation. In Tibet, Tantra was seen as 4 classes or types: Kriya, Charya, Yoga, and Anuttara Yoga. Another way of understanding these 4 classes was to see them as being either outward, Kriya Tantra, or inward, Yoga Tantra. Outward Tantra had some form of objective support for meditation and ritual performance. This could be visiting shrines to venerate images or other physical objects. Another form of this practice was the visualization of one's own body and experiencing it as the central deity. Now, inward Tantra was identified with the perfections in yogic-induced states that were part of Mahayoga, or Upaya, skill in teaching. Now, these precise divisions of Tantra in Tibet have no counterpart in other regions. So when we turn to the maritime, our lens for viewing the texts and practices must of necessity be appropriate to that environment. And it does not appear that the template created by designation of 4 types of Tantra will serve to describe or explain events. There were 3 famous tantric teachers who were credited with carrying texts identified with Tantra all the way to China. They were a generational lineage of teachers and disciples in the order of Shubhakara Simha, Vajrabodhi, and Amoghavajra. Their period during the Tang Dynasty covered roughly 100 years, from the mid-7th to the late 8th centuries. The story of Tantra in China is still being explored by scholars. Questions have arisen about whether there was an organized school or a self-sustaining movement. Did these three great masters see themselves and what they transmitted through text as a movement with distinct teachings? This issue has become, for Chinese Buddhist history, a current topic of special interest. There's no single Chinese equivalent for the word Tantra. The term Mijiao, which some translate as secret teachings, appeared in the 7th century and was associated with Vajrabodhi and his disciple Yixing, whose dates were 673 to 727. Now, Zaning, who compiled the Sung Gaoseng Zhuan in the 10th century, recognized Mijiao as a regular category for Buddhism and the community of monks. Vajrabodhi's story is a typical account of ocean travel for many Buddhists. He set sail in a fleet of 30 large ships, each capable of carrying more than 500 people. Unfortunately, the ships ran into a typhoon and had to jettison weight to keep from sinking. Now, in his case, they threw away a 100,000 verse text that he was taking to China. As the storm intensified and the ship was threatened with destruction, he began to chant from one of the texts. As he did so, he was amazed that the sea for a quarter of a mile around him stilled. This is probably the most precise description of what it was like when the eye of a storm passed directly over a ship, and suddenly there was no wind, and the sun shone in a blue sky. If this was the case, it's no wonder that he could only comprehend it as a magical shift associated with his rituals. These stories are proof of the dangers faced by sailing during typhoon season, at a time when there was no way to predict or spot the oncoming hurricane with its high winds and calm eye. Vajrabodhi bemoaned the loss of the large text and admitted that the one he brought to China was a smaller, abridged version that he happened to have in his possession. From this story, we get the idea that he was doing his best to bring a teaching to China which was not yet there. So losing a large and prized manuscript would have been very hard to face. Amoghavajra made an important statement about Mijiao, saying that something that is hidden away and then brought to light and possessed by practitioners is a wrong view. Rather, he taught, that teaching is based on a shift in the way that one sees the world. Because of a clear view of the way things are, looking at the world leads to insight. And thus it is a natural process. Now, from this perspective, one might say that Mijiao was based on how we perceive. The hidden that occurs is because one cannot see it through the projections and distortions of wrong views. One can say this is very similar to the thought found in Mahayana Sutras. But the fact remains that Amoghavajra translated a large number of texts that were quite different in content to Mahayana. The appearance of masters such as Amoghavajra and I Ching, traveling from Guangzhou to Sumatra, translating available Sanskrit text, many identified as Tantric, into Chinese, is one sign that the empowerment rituals were important in the maritime sphere. The story of Atisha would clearly be another example of someone who sought for the specific teachings of Tantra and identified Palembang as the place where such training was available. While Atisha came to Palembang in the late 11th century, some 3 centuries after Amoghavajra had been there, the center was still a major pilgrim node for sea travel. It was not until the Sung period that Palembang disappeared, but not before having fulfilled the role of a place of transmission of Buddhist thought for centuries. Indian centers for Tantra were in the old home area of early Buddhism, Bengal and Pala dynasties. From there, it had spread to Sri Lanka, and for a time was an important practice of the Sangha as well as the court. Just like the rest of Mahayana, it can be seen as a literary tradition, dependent on text and teachers, more than physical monasteries and institutional development. The question about whether this textual tradition was or should be recognized as a school in China can be answered with good reasons in the negative. But that leaves us with a new problem. The Tantric texts and the teachers who carried them into the maritime routes and eventually to China and Japan were real. If not a school, if not a conscious effort to spread information not available elsewhere, then what was the nature of the activity of producing, preserving, copying specific text by a series of masters who dedicated themselves to the dissemination of the material? Are we facing the same issue as political scientists who tried to explain Southeast Asian history through the lens of empires, only to discover that the organizing principle was the mandala for governance? We have seen in the study of maritime monasteries that political mandalas are a better way to explain their structure than an umbrella system with central authority. In this, perhaps the same way as we seek to understand the reality of Tantra, it is possible to see teachers as part of a mandala formation. Each one was an individual, having loose connections to other teachers, but able to function as something like a social node, attracting contact and support from a variety of edges that tied them to a larger system. As such, teachers were not necessarily fixed to a specific location, nor were they required to adhere to a course of study and teaching. Perhaps it's time to move beyond the limitations of schools and develop new ways of seeing and interpreting Buddhism in the Great Circle. Along the sea routes, portability was crucial for cargo as well as personnel and style of life. The power of Buddhism in such an environment succeeded to the degree that it was able to be practiced in new sites and among a multitude of ethnic and physical aspects. If we consider Amoghavajra, he is an example of someone who could sail long distances, come in contact with a variety of religious formations. In China, he was called upon to be a support for the imperial house. His rituals were requested to protect the nation from invasion and rebellion. It was not a situation where he was focused on teaching and spreading a message to the whole population. There are many stories of how royals sought to have the full attention of important masters. Even Kumarajiva was seen as a spiritual aid to the emperor and a consultant for political decisions. Rulers would send out commands for well-known teachers to come to the court. Bodhidharma was described as going to do the requisite visit to the ruler, but it's reported that he was not subservient during the encounter and was never again at court. Of all the Buddhist teachers, Amoghavajra seems to have been the most successful in his role as court official. Now, the downside of this appropriation by emperors was when political power shifted. The power of the monks associated with a particular ruler rapidly declined, and they often left no base of followers to maintain an institutional structure. And so we have a problem. How to define, evaluate the nature of Tantra that left behind many signs of its presence and importance. What are we to make of the Sri Lankan ruler's adoption of Mahayana with rituals of empowerment, and the journey of these practices and texts all the way to the Tang Dynasty emperor in China? It is not enough to simply say it was not a school with some form of central control. It was definitely something, and it deserves to be more fully explained. In this lecture, I'm suggesting that we need to explore the nature of systemic formations, some taking on the political mandala methods of operating, and others being composed of overlapping circuits and connections that allowed great freedom while still involved with influences and support. The discussion then becomes at one level the challenge of determining differences between schools and systems. Up to the present, Buddhist scholarship has used the model of schools as the primary focus for constructing a history of the tradition, especially in East Asia. Perhaps the future study will be able to give a more precise and meaningful description of events by seeing them as parts of systems of interconnections between religious, social, commercial, and governance models. In this way, tantric teachers can be viewed as individuals whose sphere of influence and support was, on the one hand, limited to them personally. However, they were not isolated from others. The texts that they used and the rituals they performed were not their own inventions. They received teachings from others. They copied texts that had been redacted by others. They were trained in ritual performance by others. They lived within a context of a system that could be traced to the early origins of Buddhism, as well as contemporary developments. And while systems may be vague outlines, it may not be fully recognized by those who are participating in them. Their reality cannot be dismissed. So in this lecture, we can be said to have dealt with the system of tantric text, monks, and rituals. It was a vast and complex system and required much more research to bring it into a more usable model for current scholarship. Thank you very much for attending the lecture today. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.